And we welcome you back to the show. The Federation of Protestant Welfare Agencies is an anti-poverty policy and advocacy organization that's committed towards economic opportunity and upward mobility. Now, FPWA has long served New York City's social service system, providing support grants to help low-income groups meet basic needs while advocating for fair policies, or I should say public policies, on behalf of the people in need and the agencies that serve them. Joining us now to share a little bit more is the CEO and Executive Director of FPWA, Jennifer Jones Austin. And Jennifer, glad to have you with us.
I'm glad to be with you, and I'm honored and appreciative for this opportunity.
Well, certainly, we're glad to have you as well. And for somebody that may not be so familiar with FPWA, a little bit about your organization.
So it's a nearly 100-year-old organization. In fact, next year, the organization will recognize its 100th anniversary. It was created back in 1922 at a time in New York City when social services were doled out based on race and religion. So if you were white and of the Jewish faith, you were cared for by Jewish institutions. If you were white and Catholic, you were cared for by Catholic charities. And as we know, if you're of the Protestant faith, often it becomes a catch-all. And so people who identified as Protestant were cared for by Protestant organizations. And even if you weren't, if you didn't identify as Jewish or Catholic, you pretty much got lumped into the Protestant grouping. And, with social services being doled out like that, it was determined that there needed to be at the decision-making table with government an organization that would represent the needs of Protestant communities, Protestant organizations, individuals and families identifying as Protestant. We've been at it now for nearly 100 years. The interesting thing is, whereas when the organization was first founded, it was largely Protestant-only nonprofits serving Protestant individuals and families, and others who, again, didn't identify as any of the others. Today, we have more organizations under our umbrella, which is like 170 plus member agencies. We have more organizations that are secular than Protestant, and we also have organizations that identify as being Jewish-based, Muslim, Buddhist, and Catholic. And the way that I think about it as a child of the church is that, we're just like doing the work of the Good Samaritan. We're not trying to figure out who you are and who you identify. We're just concerned about every individual, every family in New York that is struggling and working to make sure that their needs are met.
Yeah. And I know with such a diverse population and groups represented, you tackle a diverse group of issues. And I want to delve into a few of those issues that you guys tackle. And I know one is the issue of police brutality and, criminal justice reform, but more particularly the area of police brutality. We've seen a lot, and I know that George Floyd's, the conviction of Derek Chauvin has actually heightened that conversation. But it's been a long-standing conversation. Share with us your thoughts.
So we look at the issue of police brutality in its kind of entirety, like what is it rooted in? And we all know that racism plays a significant factor in police misconduct, disproportionate policing, disproportionate excessive use of force by the police against Black and Brown communities. What we often don't talk about, though, is the additional factor that poverty plays. Here in New York City, we often talk about, the communities with the greatest concentration of Black and Brown persons being overly policed, where we see, greater incidents of stop and frisk, which still continues today, despite, what has happened over the last several years to curtail it. It still continues. What we often don't talk about is the added element, a significant factor of poverty. If you look at the community districts here in New York City with the highest rate of justice involvement, arrest, and incarceration, you will find that they are also the communities with the highest rates of people of color residing in them. But they also are the communities with the highest rates of persons with low income. And so at FPWA, we center on that, that trifecta, that three-legged stool, that in America, when you think about justice involvement, you have to look at how race and poverty play an integral role. And so that's the way that we come at it. How do we address and get to the decriminalization of race as well as the decriminalization of poverty.
And when we talk about, the issues with the police department, we know that broken window policing is really huge. For our viewers who may not be so familiar, and we're trying to educate them on this particular matter, give us the definition from your perspective of what broken window policing actually is and what you'd like to see happen.
So broken windows theory was created many years ago. Goodness, maybe now going about back 20, 25 years here in New York City. Maybe it was something that was done in other jurisdictions, but it was brought, or state cities, was brought here back about 20, 25 years ago, maybe a little bit longer. And what broken windows theory is, essentially, it's a theory that if you address the kids, like the activities that are kind of a low level, offenses that are conducted at a low level misdemeanor rate, and you nip them in the bud then that will cut off mounting crimes. So broken windows, kids throwing rocks at broken windows, just to make it plain. Kids throwing rocks at broken windows, right? That's a low level crime, right? Maybe it gets you a summons, maybe it gets you a misdemeanor. The theory is if you stop the kids, then at that point, then they won't go on to commit larceny. They won't go on to commit burglary, robbery. They won't kind of get that kind of feeling in their system and go out and start doing bigger crimes. The crackdown on it has been to then crack down on the people who commit these lower level offenses, but kind of to do it in a harsh manner. Let's nip it in the bud. Let's exact a punishment upon you now, not doing it through a preventive approach, right? And so that's the criticism with broken windows theory. It's not just exact a punishment. Let's look at why young people may be engaging in these misdemeanor type crimes. Is it that they don't have enough after school supports or recreational activities? They're not leaned into to address what may be some of the things that have them on the street when they could be engaged in things that are more meaningful and value add. So our response is, let's not treat the problem, let's treat the underlying issue. And that's what we believe is key to keeping communities and people safe without overly, policing Black and brown communities.
We talk about I didn't mean to cut you off. But when we talk about over-policing, one of the things that we know about over-policing is use of force. What really got America shaking their head, and when we say our allies, those people, we've seen it all the time in the African-American community, communities of color, this use of force. But I think it really began to hit home for a lot of people watching the death of George Floyd. And even though that's Minneapolis, we know that we've got our own challenges across New York City. What would you like to see happen by way of use of force here?
So first and foremost, we need to, at the federal level, continue to push for the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act that would do everything from, tying federal funding for police departments across the states to making sure that they implement certain mandates around a data registry that ensures bad cops can't get fired and move from one locality to another locality, and be back in the business of exacting excessive force upon people, exerting excessive force upon people. Provisions against use of chokehold bans at the federal level. What it does is it begins to set up what is a federal set of policies and provisions in the form of legislation that serves to protect people against excessive use of force. But we also need to be doing the same thing at the state level. Here in New York, we have had some movement. We had some movement under Governor Cuomo to bring about greater protections, but much more needs to be done. Much more needs to be done at the local level. We've had a report that was presented to the New York State body, goodness, I guess maybe back in March of this year, that speaks to greater accountability, greater discipline, but we've got to make sure that we have the enforcement mechanisms in place. Greater enforcement by the Civilian Complaint Review Board, a greater accountability by the NYPD to make sure that they adhere to the changes that bring about greater protections for people, and particularly people of color.
Yeah. What brought George Floyd to the forefront was the fact that a young girl actually captured that on camera. And the discussion continues now, right here in New York City, about body cams and having body cams and the use of body cams. To me, no brainer. But
No brainer.
obviously, to the policies that be, it's something totally different. Give me your perspective on body cams. What would you like to see happen there? And why is it so hard to do something that seems so reasonable?
So, I think it's so hard. I mean, like there had been a similar debate in corrections, in the jails. Do correction officers have to use body cams, or should there be technology that controls where you can see what's going on in the jails at all times? I think ultimately it comes down to two things. One, there are cops who are doing things they should not be doing. They are using their power and the badge to exert, fluent force and undue influence over people. And there's a concern about that being caught. The unions play a great role in this. The Police Benevolent Association is a very strong union here in New York City. And they're not in favor of these things because then this information caught on camera can be used against their cops when it comes to proceedings, disciplinary proceedings. So that's part of it. I think the larger part of it is just kind of a universal feeling. You and I in our day jobs don't have people watching over our shoulder every single thing that we do. And there aren't many places where that is happening. And so there is this sense of people are human. People make mistakes. And what if everything I did, like during my 8 hours plus of work was caught on camera? I might not be my best self. The difference, the distinction to be drawn is when I'm not my best self, it isn't necessarily resulting in the potential death of another individual, another human. And so, certain liberties have to be done away with. Certain freedoms have to be done away with. I think that body cameras should be worn by every cop. And when they are off and, what is happening isn't reported, then these cops, and frankly, I dare say, not just simply when something bad happens. If it's found that certain cops have their cameras off when they shouldn't, even if nothing bad happens, they should be disciplined for that, because that then becomes a deterrent to keeping it off.
Yeah, I just happen to think if everybody's got cameras and Big Brother's watching everybody else, I don't understand why Big Brother can't watch and put camera on himself. I just don't get it myself. But I've heard
to your point, I sometimes I look at my iPhone and it's telling me where how long it's going to take me to get to my next destination. And it sometimes tell me that how long it's going to take me to get to places I'm not even going. Or, you'll Google something and the next thing you know, you turn around and the computer is giving you all types of information about that thing that you Googled. We are being watched.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I understand why we can't see it from that. They can't see it from that perspective. One thing I know that a big conversation is being had is about the demilitarization, I should say, of police. And when we see them, when we look before, back in the day growing up, officer friendly, the most he had was, the gun and the nightstick, and that was it. And I know that things have gotten worse. I know that things have gotten progressively worse. But when we look at what we're seeing right now, and we see particular scenes, it does look like a war zone sometimes in our very own communities. And the cry has been for the demilitarization of police. Where do you stand on that?
On board, and we don't have a lot of time, but I could spend an hour talking about this, and essentially talking about the system in which we're living. I'm chairing the New York City Racial Justice Commission, and a lot of my thinking is actually rooted in the teachings of my father. My father was a pastor in Brooklyn, New York, and a civil rights leader. He, along with several other ministers, including Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., founded the Progressive National Baptist Convention to bring the church into the social justice and civil rights movement. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference was in place, but that was really a conference of leaders of faith. It was not churches actually being involved in the movement as well. My father wrote a book, actually it's a book that I just republished, titled God in the Ghetto, A Prophetic Word Revisited. And in the book, he essentially breaks down the system of racism, capitalism, and militarism, all designed to work in concert to continually oppress people of color. And essentially what he helps us to appreciate in this book, in deconstructing the system, is that capitalism is kind of the end, is like kind of the end game, right? And capitalism in a society where we've determined that some people will have and some people will not. Racism is an instrument. It's the social construct that enables and that props up capitalism. Because with racism, we decide, or I should say they decided, our founding fathers and those who followed in power, decided that white persons would have, and all other persons of colors would have less. So you then use racism, racist policies, practices, legislation, and the like to further enable and allow capitalism to continue to hold. Why do we have wage inequity? Because it's and racist wage inequity, because that then allows for capitalism to thrive, because then it limits the purchasing power, which then builds equity for persons of color. Militarism is a tool that's employed against people of color across the world, and increasingly in America, to actually kind of like beat, if you will, or push people into submissive states. If I fear the police are going to kill me, then maybe I'm not going to act out. I'm not going to respond. I'm not going to question. I'm just going to be submissive. And so you see militarized practices in many of our communities of color, because it's an act of trying to get people to be more submissive and to not revolt against systems that don't work to their benefit.
Yeah. Well, before we go, I definitely want to get an opportunity for people who want to get connected to your organization, find out how they can really support the movement and things you have going on. Please tell us how.
So visit us at www.fpwa.org. And the other thing that I would implore you to do is to visit www.nyc.gov/NYC racial justice. Essentially, I'm chairing a racial justice commission, and we're trying to address how our government, in its charter, its constitution, allows racism to be propped up in everything from who gets jobs in New York City, who works with the city, who partners, who gets contracts, as well as who has decision-making power and who has access to power. So check us out.
We'll definitely do that. Jennifer Jones-Austin, been a pleasure having you here on the Social Justice Forums, and certainly we look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Appreciate you.
All righty. Well, we want you to stay with us. We do have more show. Social Justice Forums continues in a moment.